Before we go digging into the main picture here and labeling anatomy, let's take a moment to remind ourselves of where we are. Both of these pictures are a superior view of a transverse section of the spinal cord. This circular blue area in the center of this picture is the spinal cord. And it's threaded through all of the vertebral foramen of the vertebra. This teeny tiny length right here, just that, no more. Just that very little length of nerve is the spinal nerve. Remember, all of this stuff that's here coming off of the spinal cord is still obscured by the vertebra. Those structures right there are kind of threaded through this transverse canal before leaving the encasement of the vertebral column. So the yellow stuff here, all of this, is technically part of the peripheral nervous system, while all of the blue stuff here is technically part of the central nervous system. So what are these lines that are drawn here? This is a simple pathway of a reflex that a reflex might take. Sensory information is moving into the spinal cord through this blue neuron, right? And we can draw arrows going this way because we know it's moving into the spinal cord. And motor information moves out of the spinal cord, right? On this red neuron, this is motor. Notice how the sensory and motor neuron kind of have this two-way highway right here where they pass each other. And it's that very short length that is called the spinal nerve. Okay, so let's move over to the left side here, keeping in mind that this little tiny length here is what is called the spinal nerve. Roots are structures that come off the spinal cord and combine to make a spinal nerve. This right here is a ventral root. This right here is a dorsal root. Another way that we could define roots is that they are all medial to the spinal nerve. Okay, so Rami are lateral to the spinal nerve. So that means that this structure right here would be my ventral ramus, singular, and that this structure right here would be my dorsal ramus. We could also say that Rami are lateral to the spinal nerve, right? So these structures that I've labeled over here are lateral to the spinal nerve. These structures labeled over here are medial to the spinal nerve. Roots are medial, Rami are lateral. All of the ventral Rami coming off of a spinal nerve, they all split into these networks called plexuses. These are all motor plexuses. You do not have sensory plexuses. That's not how it works. There are no dorsal plexuses. There are only motor and only ventral. Take note of that. Only outgoing motor information is carried into these plexuses. Furthermore, plexuses are not named for the region of the spinal cord that they come out of. Look, there's a word brachial here. That is not a region of the spinal cord, right? That's not a spinal section, but it is the name of a plexus. I have a picture here of the brachial plexus. I also have a picture here of the cervical plexus. They both arise from C-numbered vertebra or vertebral levels, but they're very different, right? This is the brachial plexus. No argument. The plexuses are named for the region tissue that they serve, not the region of the spinal cord from which they derive. Each of these plexuses have important axons innervating somatic and visceral tissue, but it's all motor. So every axon destined for a somatic location is headed to a neuromuscular junction and carries voluntary information. Every axon headed for a visceral organ will innervate smooth muscle and will carry involuntary information. That's actually a gross generalization, but we can keep it at that for now. Notable in the cervical plexus is the nerve that innervates the diaphragm and controls breathing. And this is what is called the phrenic nerve. Christopher Reeves played Superman back in the 80s, and in the 90s he fell from a horse and sustained a neck injury, and the injury left him paralyzed, I think C7 and below, no, must have been C3, something high up. But this injury left him paralyzed not only for voluntary muscles, but for involuntary functions such as breathing, which is controlled by the phrenic nerve arising from the cervical plexus. What's really kind of inspiring is that even after his injury, he and his wife continued their philanthropic efforts. It didn't slow him down. It was kind of inspiring. The only nerve from the brachial plexus that I know, I'm kidding, I know a lot more of them, but the only one from the brachial plexus that we've actually been using as an example in this class is the ulnar nerve. Because it is the nerve that you would call your funny bone. The ulnar nerve runs between the olecranon process of your elbow and the skin overlying it. There is no cushioning there. And when you tap that elbow, the sensory axons in the ulnar nerve send information to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord immediately interprets that information and sends an action potential back saying, "Withdraw your arm, dummy." So the nerve that would control the muscles in this arm would arise from the brachial plexus. We've been using the sciatic nerve as an example a lot, and the sciatic nerve arises from both the lumbar and sacral plexuses. In fact, many Rami of the sciatic nerve exit from various levels in these two plexuses. This is why lower back issues are really hard to diagnose by symptom. I mean, I'm sure my doctor knows that my sciatic nerve is suffering, but does she actually know which level is causing the most pain? No, probably not. She doesn't. And she doesn't need to. She'll just give me a cortisone injection at the epidural space in L4 and let gravity and diffusion do the rest to the lower levels. The previous two slides were about the structures that leave the spinal cord, Rami, on the ventral side or the anterior side. And we know that nerve plexuses are only associated with the ventral side of a spinal nerve, and nerve plexuses are only associated with outgoing roots lateral to the spinal nerve. So just to make a drawing very quickly, we have only talked about information leaving the spinal cord, going out through a ramus, and then getting split up into one of those plexuses. Okay, so now let's shift our attention to the structures on the dorsal side, which are concerned mostly with sensory information. Anything dorsal should be associated with sensory. These here are the dorsal roots coming off of the spinal cord. Oh, sorry. Not this one here. This one here and this one here are the dorsal roots coming off of the spinal cord. Of course, we have the left and the right? And the same definition still applies to these roots. They are between the spinal cord and the spinal nerve, which is just this little tiny area right here. But this time they are dorsal. I want you to ignore the big bump in the dorsal root right now, but take a look at this diagram up top. There is no plexus on these dorsal incoming rami, right? There's no plexus there. And correct, we do not have sensory plexuses. There is only one dorsal ramus singular, and there are many ventral rami, plural. The distinctive structure on the dorsal roots is this bump right here. And this bump is called the dorsal root ganglion, and we can abbreviate it as DRG. A ganglion is just a bunch of cell bodies. That's what it means. So for example, we could have a whole bunch of axons from unipolar sensory cell neurons aggregating here in the dorsal root ganglion. In a previous chapter, we did designate the neurons with cell bodies coming off the axon as unipolar. And most sensory neurons are unipolar, whereas most motor neurons are multipolar. So follow me as I draw this here. Information from a unipolar sensory neuron, and we'll say that there's a little like tactile disc on the end of it. It would enter the dorsal ramus. It would pass through the spinal nerve. Its little cell body would come off of it in the dorsal root ganglion. And then the axon technically becomes part of the dorsal root, and then it enters into the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion, as you can see, it holds the cell body of the unipolar neuron, but in fact, there are many unipolar neurons entering into this one ramus. And so the dorsal root ganglion holds the cell body for many neurons. And this over here on this picture is also the DRG. Let's once again look at the superior view of a transverse section of the spinal cord. And let's label posterior and anterior, or let's label dorsal, because that's the spinous process and that reaches dorsally, and ventral. And we know that this is the body of the vertebra and that body is anterior. Let's highlight these short spinal nerves. Right? And let's label them. This is a spinal nerve, and just this little tiny area right here is a spinal nerve. Forcing both of my decisions to label anterior and posterior and the spinal nerves, this is the dorsal root ganglion. And I know that because I've labeled the dorsal and ventral. I know that the dorsal root ganglion exists medial to the spinal nerve or between the spinal nerve and the spinal cord. So labeling these two things first, the spinal nerve and the spinal cord, it allows me to clearly label the dorsal and ventral rami. Many of the mini lectures that come after this one, especially those that talk about gray matter of the spinal cord, we'll use this characteristic diagram on the left. We will probably never again look at a transverse section of the spinal cord as it is encased in all of its meninges and against the background of a vertebra. I would recommend that you take the picture on the left and print out many of them so that you can fill them out quickly and easily when we talk about how information moves into and then back out again the spinal cord. This is what we have established here in this mini lecture. The route through which information enters the spinal cord, and then the route through which information leaves the spinal cord. In later mini lectures, we have to then talk about what happens to that information while it is in the spinal cord.